Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this special session on competition, dynamism, and growth, and no doubt lots of other interrelated topics which are all at the heart of creating value in the economy. I'm Tera Allas. I'm a senior advisor at McKinsey, but also chair of the advisory committee for the Productivity Institute, and luckily also on the ESCoE advisory board. So very excited to hear today's presentations and also the discussion, which I'm sure will be fascinating. I'm not going to go into lots of long introductions because I've seen the slides and there's so much amazing content in store for us. Just to say that we are first going to hear from Jakob Schneebacher, who works at the CMA at the macro unit, which I'm sure he might want to say a bit more about, and also is part of ESCoE. We're then going to hear from Diane Coyle from Cambridge University, Industrial Strategy Council, and also ESCoE. And finally, Richard Davies from Allas and the Economics Observatory. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jakob.
Thanks, Tera, and thanks everyone else for being here. This is based on work with my colleagues at the CMA Microeconomics Unit, and obviously all views on my own. I know Diane and Richard are going to bring their perspectives to bear, so I thought I'd just start with some basic facts about competition and dynamism in the UK. So just, I guess, for context, for those of you who are maybe coming fresh to these issues, there's really two claims in the academic debate around these issues. The first is essentially one of measurement, right? So it's about whether or not competition has declined across the economy rather than in specific industries or market, and sort of associated with the work of De Lucker and his co-authors. And the second is sort of a causal claim that this decline in competition has depressed growth, and people have conjectured all sorts of different avenues for that. I guess most pertinently to the discussion today, that this rise in market power in the aggregate has reduced business dynamism. There have been claims that it's reduced corporate investment, or that it has distorted labor markets, and I'll have a little bit to say about that. But just to say in advance that this is sort of very much still a live debate. Are still being argued over. Now, this is certainly a global debate, a debate that has also involved the UK, but most of the evidence to date has come from the US. So I thought sort of to frame this debate here today, I just bring some UK-based facts based on the work with my colleagues. So the first question we want to answer is, well, has competition changed in the aggregate? And that's really hard to measure because sort of the standard tools that we use in I/O to understand market power, they don't really scale to the whole of the economy. But so thanks to these methods by De Lucker and co-authors, we increasingly have these tools to think about market power. And the idea is essentially that if you look at the production choices that firms make, then this tells us something. If we know something about the production technology, then we can sort of infer from the output choices and the input choices that firms are making whether there are frictions in these markets. And mostly this literature has equated frictions with market power, although there are other things that could be in there. We can talk about sort of the measurement and estimation issues later, but I just want to give you some high-level figures first. So just to fix your ideas, the seminal De Lucker paper for the US finds a rise in market power in recent decades of about 40%. That number has been disputed for the US as well now. But what we find for the UK is that number is substantially lower. So our baseline, and again, we can talk about why we think this is the best estimate we have, finds about a 10% rise in markups, in cost markups over the past 25 years. So this is one way of getting at competition. The other, and this is sort of particularly relevant to the discussion today, is this idea of business dynamism, right? So, market power is essentially a snapshot, or markups are a snapshot of market power at one moment in time. But maybe we don't worry so much about firms capturing an entire market if it's easy for new entrants to come in and contest that market and replace incumbents firm. Unfortunately, regardless of how we look at it, business dynamism also has fallen over roughly this period. So, here I'm showing you 4 different measures: firm entry and exit rates, job reallocation rates. So this is essentially the jobs being created and destroyed both by incumbent firms and entrants and exiters. I think Richard has a sort of bit more detail on that. And then the employment and turnover shares of young firms. I couldn't fit it on here, but if you look at the persistence of the largest firms at the top of the industries, then that's also increased, right? So that's yet another measure of dynamism having gone down. Now, a couple of things to say about this, right? So I think a lot of researchers have looked at these 2 trends in the aggregate and have argued that because market power has increased and business dynamism has decreased, that there is some sort of link between the 2. Now, there are a couple of reasons to maybe be a little bit skeptical of jumping too quickly to that conclusion. One is that, and I think Diane will speak to this, but the decline in business dynamism is really something that has happened across a large number of countries, regardless of their trends in markups. The second is, and this is what I'm showing you here, that actually if you look across industries, the correlation both in levels and in changes between business dynamism and markups is, if anything, positive, right? So business dynamism is higher in industries that have higher markups. So this sort of accords a bit more closely with our, I would say, standard Econ 101 tradition, intuition that profits create incentives for entry. And again, we see this both in the levels and in the changes. We can come back in the panel discussion to sort of what are some of the potential drivers, because we talk about this in our report at fair length. I guess just at a high level, there's a couple of different ways that you can look at this problem that give you different insights into it. One that I won't cover now, but that we can go into in the discussion afterwards, is to what extent this is driven by changes in technology versus changes in sort of market structure and firm conduct. The other one, and I do want to talk a little bit about this, is whether this market power that firms have is coming from output markets or from input markets. And when I say input markets, purely for measurement reasons, we're looking here at labor markets. And again, just to sort of put this UK debate in a wider international context, for the US, researchers found that it's not just cost markups that are rising, but also wage markdowns, so the equivalent measure of market power in the labor market, and that the overall rise in market power is roughly coming 2/3 from the output market, 1/3 from the input market. So what does the UK look like? Actually, in the UK, over the last 15 years or so, labor market power seems to have fallen. There's different ways you can get at this. So here I'm showing you wage markdowns, which we compute in sort of a similar way to cost markups from firm production data. But we've estimated, likewise, the wage penalty that's associated with labor market concentration coming from employee data, and we find exactly the same trend. We have a piece in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy where we get at some of the drivers, and if there's interest, we can cover that later. Now, so the trend is overall I guess, positive in labor markets. But that doesn't mean that there aren't parts of the UK economy that are less dynamic. And so there's certainly room for improvement. So I'll show you two charts here. The first one, so that you can think of many sources of labor market power. One, which is sort of the traditional way that economists are thinking about it, is labor market concentration. So if there's a single employer in a labor market, that gives the firm power over potential workers and the ability to shade down the wages that they offer. So when we estimate this from both employment data and vacancies data for the UK, we find that while on average concentration is sort of low and stable in the UK, there are certainly areas here in dark green, so the southwest, Wales, the north of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, where labor market concentration is elevated and crucially hasn't really come down in the last 15, 20 years or so. The other source or potential source of labor market power comes from the contractual arrangements that workers enter with their employers. So we call this wider class of clauses restrictive covenants. So what that captures is all the clauses that essentially prohibit an employee from doing something that they would otherwise do. Here I'm singling out specifically non-compete clauses. So these are agreements that prohibit an employee from either starting a competitor firm or moving to a competitor firm. And what a competitor firm is in these clauses is often quite widely and nebulously defined. So this is some of the first evidence we have on non-compete agreements in the UK. And I think the main takeaway is just how widespread they are. We show they are used across industries. They're used across the whole income distribution, and even in jobs where sort of the pro-competitive arguments for non-compete clauses seemingly don't apply. And we do show at least suggestive survey evidence that a sizable minority of workers with non-competes has declined an offer to join a competitor or to start a competitor because of their clauses. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to cover before handing over to Diane and Richard is just a bit of a forward look. So as you may know, the government is writing their industrial strategy white paper as we speak. The industrial strategy green paper puts quite a heavy emphasis on business dynamism. So I just wanted to flag up a few results from a recent report we did into both how well industrial policies have worked in the past, but then also sort of what we can say about the government's chosen what they call the growth driving sectors. So just a couple of points. So the first one is the growth driving sectors do what it says on the tin. They are, as we show in the report, they are generally more productive, they're more competitive, so markups are lower, they're more dynamic, entry rates generally are higher, exit rates are higher, job relocation rates are higher, persistence is lower than the rest of the economy. Although we show that actually once you dig beyond the headline numbers, there are certain pockets of sort of competitive concern. The second thing I wanted to show is that if we think about the propagation of any gains from an industrial strategy, we want to think how these industries are linked to other parts of the economy, both in terms of the production network, which is what I'll show you now, and in terms of sort of their spatial distribution, which is what I'll show you next. So in the supply chains, what this graph is showing you is, so 2 dimensions. The vertical axis essentially measures how far upstream an industry is, right? So if you think down here are final goods consumers, up there are raw materials. So the chosen sectors here in dark blue tend to be on average more upstream than the rest of the economy. This is, from the literature, this suggests that we can expect some of the gains in these sectors to then propagate downstream along supply chains. The left to right axis measures how connected, both directly and indirectly, these industries are to the rest of the economy. And again, you can see that they tend to be much more central, much more connected than the typical industry in the UK. So I'll close here and I'll sum up. I guess the other way that sort of this productivity and dynamism can propagate is through spatial linkages. And this is just for later discussion, I guess. But one of the things we do highlight is that the areas that establishments in the key growth-driving sectors are concentrated in tend to be quite different from the parts of the country that we have focused our industrial strategies and our subsidies in the past 10 or so years. All right, so just to sum up, market power, at least as measured by cost markups, has increased somewhat at the same time as business dynamism has fallen. We can talk about the causes in the discussion afterwards. Most of this decrease seems to come, or in the UK's case, all of the increase seems to come from the output side rather than the labor market side. This doesn't mean that there aren't constraints to dynamism stemming from the labor market side as well. And finally, looking forward, business dynamism really seems to be a key component of sort of the selection of industrial strategy growth industries. But again, we want to think a little bit about these wider linkages as well. So just to flag some questions for further discussion. One is a question of measurement. So for the US, we have a very good sense of the contribution of competition to productivity. That's harder to do with the ABS, so that's an evidence gap. From a causal point of view, I think it's still very much an open debate what's behind the slowdown in dynamism. And related but distinct, there's a question of sort of program evaluation around what policy levers government has to accelerate dynamism, regardless of what the underlying causes are. And with that, I think I'm handing over to Diane.
As Tera said, I am a member of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, and I suppose I need to get used to saying I speak only for myself and not for any of the other members, of course. But it's an independent body, so luckily I can say what I think. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. So I was very struck by this chart from the paper cited at the bottom, which shows for European countries 2 measures of declining dynamism since the charts start in 2000, go through to 2020. And the left-hand panel is job reallocation, and the second panel is what share of employment is there in young firms. So, the overall impression, of course, is that this is decline everywhere, so it's not happening just in the UK. These countries have very different labour market structures, and so there are clear differences in the patterns because whatever forces are driving the decline in dynamism is getting refracted through those structures differently. But the downward trend is really quite striking. So when you're thinking about what are the causes, you need to think about drivers that are not just UK specific. If you look within the UK, though, we have done some work, and Jonathan Haskell and Peter Goodrich have a very similar paper showing that on various reallocations of productivity slowdown to sectors, the slowdown has the biggest contributions to productivity slowdown, and this is the period 2008 to 2019, has come from some surprising sectors. And surprising because it's high-value areas and areas where there are more intangibles. So it's information and communication. Within manufacturing, it's the high-value parts of manufacturing, finance, this is slightly puzzling. Why is it in these sectors that we see a biggest decline in the contribution to productivity growth? We did this in our paper for some other countries as well, and there are, again, country differences, but it's the same kinds of sectors in other advanced industrial economies that have experienced a productivity slowdown. So we're looking for something that can operate across countries for common drivers, and we're also trying to understand why it is that the productivity slowdown, which is linked to declining business dynamism, is biggest in some of the more high value added sectors and intangible intensive sectors. So that's the sort of puzzle. And there are lots of potential culprits here, which I've listed. So one of them is the one that Jakob was just talking about, the market power argument. And there is a very large literature now on what's been happening to margins, on the role of superstar firms, which is related to technology, obviously. A lot of this evidence is about the US, so I think getting more on what's happening in the UK would be a really useful thing to do. But that's one set of arguments. But it's not the only potential driver of declining business dynamism. One that I find quite persuasive, Jim Besson has been prominent in arguing, and it's about the increasing complexity of production at the frontier, and helps explain why it's the larger firms that have seen the biggest gains in productivity, more persistence, higher margins. And the argument is that if you wanted to get into a high-value activity 20 years ago, the technological capabilities that you would need to do that were much more straightforward. There was more labor availability, and the actual workflow of putting together what you would need to deliver the product that or service that you're producing for customers was much more straightforward. Jim used to be a software entrepreneur himself, and so he compares in his latest book what it took for him to set up his very successful software publishing company that he later got out of, compared to what it would need to do the same kind of activity today. And so there's an argument about just the complexity of high-value production. There is a separate argument about the cost of failing. And this is something that I've taken from Olivier Coste, who's a New York venture capitalist, used to work in the European Commission, has fed some of this into the Draghi report on industrial policy in the EU. And his perspective as a venture capitalist is that if you are investing in a portfolio of firms, you know that most of them are going to fail. So the cost of them failing becomes material to the return that you expect as an investor. And he's done a lot of work looking at the figures on how much does it cost to do that kind of restructuring in different countries. And I'll just skip to the next slide and then skip back. So these are his figures from listed companies. So the data is taken from annual reports, and the blue countries are Germany, Italy, France, and the UK is the smaller blue bar. So we're mid-Atlantic, as we are in so many things. The US and the US tech sector are on the right-hand side, and then the flex security sectors, Denmark and Switzerland, have the lowest restructuring costs. And so he's done some calculations showing that the amount of time that you've got to consult, pay people's salaries, pay for retraining afterwards, makes a material difference to the amount of capital that's available to invest in new startup firms. Now, I hope I can go backward in this. Yes. So that's another possibility, and that's got some traction in European policy circles. And then there's two other arguments about the global restructuring of production. So the Jim Besson argument is about internal restructuring, internal production. But then if you think about production networks, I think there are a couple of issues here. The first is that in manufacturing, production chains that span different countries have become increasingly prevalent, and more so in higher value areas of manufacturing. And there you're looking at these really close contractual relationships. So as an example, think about Apple's iPhone and the degree of skill and expertise, the learning by doing that's happened in Foxconn, which is one of its major supply chain producers. They've got very tight contractual relationships, but also they're highly trusted relationships. They've been in existence for many years. And so that reduces production flexibility. And I haven't seen anybody looking at the implications for the traditional make or buy literature. There might be something, I just haven't found it. But it's that sort of argument about why there's more rigidity in production patterns in the sectors like high-value manufacturing, where we've seen that slowdown in dynamism. And then another aspect of global production chains is that they have become very specialized. And this is core Adam Smith, that the gains from the productivity gains come from increasing specialization, the division of labor, the scope of the market has to increase at the same time. The other bit of Adam Smith is that competition drives productivity. And yet we've got to a situation where in some of these production chains, each link is so specialized that the efficient size of the market is one or two firms. And so I've got this paper called Adam Smith's Dilemma that spells this out a bit more. But again, the argument is that because of specialization, competition and dynamism have reduced at certain parts of those supply chains. Now, those are all arguments that might apply internationally because, as I said right at the start, this is an international phenomenon. But there are certainly UK-specific challenges as well, and these will be really familiar to us. We've got the argument about finance for scale-ups. We've got many companies that are unable or unwilling to go public, and so we're looking at venture capital investment. We've got a healthy VC sector compared to continental Europe, but much, much less deep than the US. Challenges about infrastructure, which are well known, about planning. That speaks to labour market flexibility as well, because we don't build houses. And so people need to be able to travel to work if they're going to switch jobs. And we've got a terrible transport network as well. So something about coordinating housing and transport and improving planning policy. And then the general issues about policy coordination in the UK. So we have our own special problems, but I think there are many candidates for the international pattern. Done that one. There's a question in my mind about how this evolves going forward because of the new technologies. I mean, obviously, there's just a ton of ridiculous hype about AI, but also some real possibilities for using it as a process improvement. This is a chart from a paper. What this chart says is that if you're going to adopt a new technology, you've got the costs of the technology, which in the case of AI are using the cloud, the license that you pay, getting your data in order, and then the organizational costs. And our argument is that because we're looking at a period of process re-engineering, the organizational costs are actually quite high. This comes from a qualitative study looking at some digital adopter firms in various sectors, but also some chief information officers in incumbent firms who are nervous about adopting digital. And so looking at these organizational costs will be informative about the extent to which we can see the new technologies driving future dynamism in the UK. And I think looking more closely at how policy can reduce some of those organizational barriers would be interesting. So, for example, something like training and skills is an area where there's an obvious policy intervention. I want to end by talking about the measurement gaps. And one of them is about supply chains. I don't know where the mapping data that you showed, Jakob, came from. Was it business transactions, business-to-business transactions? So more of that, please. I think it's really important to have that kind of evidence. So the value-added and trade data at sectoral level is clearly useful, but for thinking about how do markets operate, that's a much lower level of aggregation. And so using more transactions data of that kind to understand the supply chain links and how these are changing over time, and the extent to which they are crossing international boundaries as well, is really important. So as a member of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, I would plead for it becoming much easier to look at the industrial strategy sectors, because these sectors, as they're defined in policy, and perfectly sensibly, I think, because they are highly productive sectors, it's not completely straightforward. And the supply chain issue maps onto this as well. So if you think about life sciences and how do you define that as a sector as opposed to pharmaceuticals and anything else, there are specialist professional services that are part of life science supply chains, and they're nothing like the big accounting companies or the law companies that we might naturally think of as business and professional services. So thinking about how to make that easier to get at would be really helpful. Measurement of intangibles, a bit of progress in SNA 2025, but I think more to be done there on measurement. And in particular, because of the technological change that's going on now, speeding that up. And in particular, looking at data. How much data is there? What use is it? Where is it? Who can access it? Is it reference data? So a lot of issues about the value of data use and indeed the quantity of data use in the economy, I think would be really useful. And then up-to-date, really speedy information about AI adoption, because the technology offers both opportunities and risks in terms of business dynamism. And the risk is clearly that the big tech companies in the US who are developing frontier AI models are also going to capture the application layer, bundle things together, and that will feed their market power through into what could be a vibrant downstream application market. And the opportunity is that there's that potential for a vibrant downstream application market. The AI is always thought to be a UK strength, and I profoundly disagree with that. We've got DeepMind, it's owned by Google, it's headquartered in California, in Mountain View. The rest of the UK sector is small companies, and a lot of them aim to get bought by Google or one of the other big tech companies. So I think we've actually got quite a weak AI sector, but a really strong research base that offers an opportunity to use the technology to increase dynamism in the UK economy. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. I've knocked this off. Do you know where this is supposed to go?
Quite high.
Go high is the answer, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all today, and thank you very much for this invitation to talk about this important project and topic. We haven't had this chart. How have we not had this chart? And it's come to me to show it. So this is something that one of my colleagues did. I mean, you can debate whether the pre-recession trend was this curve, actually. Maybe that's a little bit journalistic. But something serious happened in the UK around the time of the financial crisis, and has become, over time, what we called in the Economy 2030 report, the foundational challenge of the UK economy. I like that line, it was my line. I think it is the foundational challenge, because just think about what you could do with 24% more GDP. The Chancellor's challenge would fundamentally change in terms of debt to GDP. So many things would be different in the economy, real wages and so on. It's at the root of lots of the questions we see. The investment shortfall, the fact that the FTSE, not just the FTSE 100, the FTSE 250 underperforms. All of these things, I think, would be ameliorated with higher productivity. So this is the challenge and this is the timing. Diane showed that lots of these things we need to think about internationally, and that's definitely the case. But we do seem to be kind of worst in class. So I think maybe it's something that there are OECD advanced economy things going on, but there are also UK specific things going on. So what these bars do is they look at cumulative productivity growth, both pre and post crash. 2008 crash, and you can see that everybody's bar is lower, but the UK's differential is by far the greatest. So something specific happening in the UK. One of the problems we have in the UK, so this data, this comes from the kind of headline ONS macro data, so that's going to be GVA over hours worked. Those things are going to come fundamentally from surveys. We've heard all about the problems with the ONS surveys. So one thing you might be concerned about is this a measurement problem? When you look in the microdata, so this is from the BSD microdata database, and this is the population of firms, and this is two different measures. So on the top, you've got revenue, and on the bottom you've got number of employees, and people in the literature call this revenue, labour, productivity, well, you see the same thing, broadly. There's a change that happens around the time of the financial crisis. So that, to me, I think we can put away the kind of measurement error kind of queries about this chart. It's there in the microdata. This microdata is the population of firms. Two pictures of sharks here, because I think there are two really important and different stories about productivity. And I think they, often when I read things, I think, which of these stories am I supposed to be thinking about here? And I think it applies to some of these things we have talked about today and should shape our thinking. So hopefully this will be a memorable slide. So there's a diffusion story, and that is, I've got these remora fish. They're fish with suckers on that attach themselves to sharks, and other fish, whales and so on. And so that's a kind of symbiotic relationship. The shark swims faster, the remora fish travel through the ocean faster. There's a similar story about productivity, which you will read, and there's a whole literature on diffusion. So what do you want? You want frontier firms that are inventing new things, and then those things diffuse through the economy and go to the smaller firms. Okay? The other story is a much less nice story. It's a much more kind of Darwinian story, and it's a story in which the little fish get eaten, right? So this is a story about starting up firms, failing firms, bigger firms buying smaller firms buying bigger firms, maybe. But it's a much more kind of creative destruction type process. And I just think we need to remember this as economists and double check some of the things we're saying. So if we think that fundamentally, and there's a whole literature on this, that diffusion is important, do we not want more mega firms? Isn't that us building more mega sharks and then all the other little firms attached to it? So having these two things in mind, I think, is important. What does the modern literature do? And just to give a bit of historical basis for it, I like a bit of history. This is the first production function by von Thunen, or Thunen. I'm not sure how I should pronounce that. Can I be corrected?
Don't look at me.
Thunen. This is the first production function. And it's basically a production function approach. So what are we looking to do? We're saying we've got a bunch of inputs. Those things become GDP. And historically, we've had an aggregate production function. That's the one in capitals I've got here. And then in the modern literature, we say, no, let's go down to the micro level and look at individual firms, hence the small letters and the lower case capitals, lower case and I's for each individual firm. And then think about individual, and that would be the Z's, firm effects in terms of productivity. So each firm has got its own kind of individual level of productivity, and that could be to do with the quality of its managers, it could be how innovative it is, a whole plethora of different things. When you look at the microdata, and this is some stuff that I did in the BSD, you definitely see a drop after 2008 in job reallocation. So these bars are the simple sums of entry, exit, fires and hires. There's no regressions going on here, and again, this is the population of firms, so this is just a stylized fact. The drop is not huge, but if you think about the way reallocation works, let's think about fires and hires. Well, a firm is letting go of workers, other firms are hiring workers, so this is workers moving around, and that's something that's not something, let's say, like the inflation rate, which after a year washes away. You should think of it more like the price level. This is something that doesn't wash away. This is something that accumulates. So if people don't move between firms in year one, and then another bunch of people don't move between firms in year two, the year one people still haven't moved. So this would accumulate over time. So I actually think that's a pretty big effect. It's not an industry shift story, so this is the same thing, but just broken down into a pre and post period, and then done across industries. And clearly, there's a shift down across large industries in the UK. So it's industry wide. I won't go into that. So from a more technical, well, just very quickly, for those that want to know what this literature does, it's really simple. It just goes back to this guy, production function, this idea, break down the production function, put it in a regression, think about changes in employment, and then relating that to individual firms' productivity, individual firms' size, shocks to productivity, and so on. And the different people have done this in different ways. I've done it, Ryan Decker, Javier Miranda and so on in the US have done it. You can put in a bunch of different controls and so on. But basically what you're going to find is that these coefficients, this is how much your employment changes, and this will be how much, let's say, a shock to your individual productivity. Over time, this thing, how much you react to your own change in productivity is going down. Okay? So there's two different things here. One is a stylized fact. This is the thing that the panel have already shown you, which is that job reallocation is going down. That's just in the numbers. This is regression, so you can argue about it, but lots of people have found similar things now, which is we think that if you're going along, you invent something, you become better at doing things, you should hire more. You should be that shark gobbling up the smaller fish. And so, and this would then be the measure, this first beta of your change in responsiveness. And that thing is going down. Why does it matter that people are shifting around less, that there's less of the sharks gobbling up the fishes going on? Well, because there's a big productivity ladder in the UK, as there is in other countries, but it's really big. And it's the kind of thing that could have macroeconomic effects. So these are productivity deciles for different industries for the UK, so going from the 10th decile to the 90th decile. And the point is that if you move, obviously if you move, let's say, from the 10th to the 90th, you're going to get a big effect. But if you just move, for example, in, let's say, wholesale and retail trade, from the 40th decile firm to the 60th decile firm, you go from 65 to 100. That's and clearly productivity would change a bit, but the difference in productivity between firms, they're actually quite close in distribution, is very, very large. So potentially a reshuffling of workers can give you a big productivity kick. I mean, the reason I focused on these is because there's clearly a big puzzle, and on some of this stuff, the timing here works. So I think the timing is indicative of this being the problem. What are the deeper causes? I am suspicious of the level of credit in the UK economy. This is something I should say that, for example, the Bank of England have looked at and not particularly found a shortfall because demand following the crash went down. But the red line is the lending to GDP ratio, which you can see is way, way, way down on the level of the crash. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's at a historic level, maybe that convinces you, maybe it doesn't, but certainly UK firms have found it very hard to borrow from banks, and as Diane said, we have a very bank-based system. There's not a big VC or mid-market capital system in the UK. I won't show this chart yet. Here's my Thursday morning economics test for everyone, because we've got some younger people in the audience. What happened to property prices during the financial crash? If that's kind of flat, what happened to UK house prices? Anyone give a guess with their hand down? They went down, right? No, they didn't go down. They were flat and went up a bit. Okay. What happened to UK commercial property prices, which we never talk about? This is what happened. Okay. One of the problems, and Diane touched on this, and I firmly agree with it, we have of the kind of over analysis of the similarities between the UK and the US is that we had a crash at the same time and we feel it was the same thing. Our crash and the long run problem that Lloyds and RBS had were not to do with houses, they were to do with commercial real estate. Okay, and commercial real estate is still well below, this is in nominal terms, right? So if you did this in kind of inflation adjusted terms, maybe you wouldn't want to do that with something which is a price measure, but you're way, way, way below your pre-crisis peak, and firms will have taken out loans during this higher period based on those capital values. So one cause could be a credit crunch. Different kind of financial cause could be too easy finance. So the idea here would be, and Philippe Aghion has a couple of interesting papers here, which formalize an idea which actually was discussed at the time of the financial crisis and was kind of dismissed. And I thought rightly so at the time, but maybe kind of thinking about this stuff, maybe it was wrong. And that was the idea that having interest rates too low actually got softened a kind of creative destruction that was needed. You needed firms to go out of business. And the people that liked this story talked about the 1992 recession in the UK, which had actually a surge in interest rates and a surge in bankruptcies. And then the idea is then people can start anew. And Philippe Aghion's recent work kind of formalizes this. The idea is that there are firms, not necessarily quite zombie firms, but firms essentially, in his argument, that are much slower to innovate, that are stringing along with their creditors, and at a higher interest rate, they go out of business and people with better ideas, or as he puts it, quicker ideas, come into the market. So it could be too little money from banks, it could be too easy money from banks. Could be increasing concentration. We've discussed that, so I'll skip over it. The market power argument. But maybe it could also be the fact that higher markups, the use of that pricing power, and particularly the use of that pricing power, this is, I guess, the wrong diagram, to lower wages, maybe because workers have become so cheap, there's no incentive to hire and fire. You know, they're just a kind of an easy input. And so firms have become less focused on shrinking or lowering their workforce. I think overall, which is good, academic economists would always say this, there's just big puzzles out there, because I don't think any of these stories, and hopefully we can discuss it now, fully stack up. So these are the weaknesses. If it was a credit crunch, why don't we see like firms really bidding up the cost of credit? And we don't see that. If it's easy finance, why does quantity fall quite so much? Again, you can tell me a demand-supply argument there, but I just don't think it stacks up. Market power, if it's market power, but we know that big firms invest a lot, they do all the investment, and we know that investment then diffuses. So we've got recent evidence on this. And we know there's not much of a change, this is the point you made, in the UK in concentration ratios. And if it's cheap workers, and so firms aren't going to adjust it, but then that gives workers the incentive to move more, doesn't it? So I think this is, in summary, I think it's the foundational challenge for the UK. But I think, 17 years on now, we still don't have quite the story that explains it all. And hopefully we'll come up with that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I love it when we finish on a puzzle, because that means there's going to be lots of interesting questions to dig deep into. We can now open it up for discussion and debate. I have some questions for the panel to start with, and indeed, if panelists can think of questions for each other, that's also very much allowed, especially if you disagree. I found there was quite a lot of consensus, which is a great starting point, but some of these kind of really challenging questions to tackle as well. I guess my first question, and I am looking at you, audience, in case you want to raise your hand. There's a mic which will be brought to you when you want to speak. Yeah, in a minute. I wanted each of you to maybe comment a little bit more on that tension between what do we actually think about big firms or superstar firms, or those who really pull forward in terms of productivity growth. Because on one hand, arithmetically, they're kind of in the moment, they are quite important in actually shifting aggregate productivity, and it's a concern that some of this may have slowed down. But on the other hand, the sharks argument, if they end up gobbling up all the small firms, then does that mean we're destroying or sacrificing future growth, future innovation, future creative destruction? So would love your thoughts on that. Maybe starting with Jakob, because you're nodding enthusiastically.
I mean, I'll give part of a cop-out answer, right? I think both things are going on, and so then the real question is empirically which force dominates, right? And so a couple of pieces of evidence that we can bring to this, right? In our State of Competition report, we show that in the sectors that see big rises in markups, there's evidence that returns to scale are increasing, right? So that's something is changing about the production technology that sort of favors large firms, right? Now, of course, this can still have negative downstream competition impacts, right? The second thing to sort of raise is, we want turnover to move to the most productive firms, right? We just want to make sure that newcomers have the chance to come in and contest that, right? And so Nate Miller calls this rise in markup that is driven by a consolidation of turnovers at the most productive firms, competition in action. The trick with the UK is that you'd really want to do that, this decomposition at the firm level, because we know it's really individual superstar firms in narrowly defined industries rather than sort of the shift between industries. And unfortunately, the nature of the ABS means that we currently can't do that well. So I think that's a really big evidence gap, and I think this is where all of us who are working with this data are really looking towards the HMRC firm level revenue data, so we can speak to that question.
Thank you, and there's no doubt that in a conference about measurement, one of the recommendations is always going to be more data, but I'm not saying that flippantly. I think it is fundamental, as all of you have said, for us to understand these problems more carefully and to be able to come up with policy solutions. Diane, I wonder what your take on this two different types of sharks question is.
It's why I'm interested in thinking about this through the lens of supply chains rather than sectors. I think the sectoral approach now actually obscures understanding what's going on. There's obviously the trade-off between short-term and long-term. So we worry about what happens to dynamism long-term if you have the friendly sharks who are carrying everybody else along with them. And I don't know that there's an easy answer to that at all. The other thing to lob in is that actually nationality matters more, and that's partly because of geopolitical context, but also partly because I've changed my mind about this. I used to think it didn't matter if you got all your components made in Malaysia or somewhere else. And I've been persuaded by arguments by engineers. There's a great paper by Gregory Tassi in 2014 about the importance of rooting manufacturing and production expertise in your own country. And that's why in the tech sector, I would worry about all of the activity being driven by the big tech companies. Amazing people and innovation goes on there, but we need to make sure that we can do it and keep it rooted here as well.
Richard, do you want to add? Because you obviously have already given us a bit of your view, but...
yeah, I mean, the only thing to add would be to kind of second Diane's point about, although I showed some stuff on industries, we had an interesting paper this week at the LSE showing R&D through patent citations, R&D networks. And there's a very clear story there where if you are the sort of friendly shark, let's say, and you invent a new thing and then patent it, then the downstream companies from you that regularly cite your payments, which may not be in your industry, but they use your components and stuff, their share price will also rise. So clearly, one of the things we need to think about is a non-industry but supply chain way of doing things. I still am puzzled, though, by the fact, because what I take from Jakob's work is really that, yeah, we know that the superstar firms thing is a thing. It's kind of become almost like a received wisdom in economics. Actually, it's not that much of a thing in the UK. And our kink in productivity is like the biggest in the world. So just on a very simple timing causal thing, I just don't see how the markup, the concentration ratio or the markup lines for the UK can explain that massive kink in the productivity.
Yeah, I guess there's many different definitions of superstar firms. You could be in a very competitive industry and still be a superstar firm, I think, as you know. But we'll come back to some of these questions later. I know there were questions from the audience, from Jonathan, and then we'll start at the back because the mic is right there, and then we'll come down to Jonathan in a sec.
My question's about, so how much do you buy it? Like a de-Ritter argument of like intangible investment is always going to be scalable, and as such, competition is always going to suffer when intangible investment goes up. And if you buy it, what are possible interventions that you can do to reduce those sort of barriers to entry in intangible intensive industries?
Shall we get answers to that question first? I'm looking at Jonathan, and it doesn't sound like your question is similar. So I don't know, any of the panelists want to comment on intangibles and policy implications of them potentially just being inherently more intense and creating market power because the entry barriers go up?
It seems to me it depends on the kind of intangible. I mean, just thinking about this off the top of my head, I haven't thought about it very deeply. I mean, the Besson argument is partly a similar argument. But I think there are other types of intangibles, and particularly data, that might differ there, because to the extent to which they scale is just not as clear as for other intangibles. So it's a good question. I want to think about it more.
Thank you. Jonathan, can we have the mic down here, please?
I think Jonathan might know the answer to that question.
Well, indeed, feel free to provide your commentary as well.
Thanks very much, Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. I enjoyed all the presentations very much indeed. Tera, you said there was a fair amount of agreement, so I'm going to disagree very strongly. And Jakob, I'm going to disagree with you very strongly, if I may, which is this. If one wants to measure these market power indices, you're fundamentally comparing some outputs and some inputs, right? Either the rate of return on capital, in which case you need to know what capital is employed, or if you're doing production functions, changes in output versus the various changes of inputs. If you're going to do all of that, since this is a measurement conference, you better measure all the inputs, right? And, you know, so you know where I'm going on this. If we don't measure what the intangibles are, you've just got a gigantic omitted variable bias problem. So I would contend that this market power argument has just taken us completely in the wrong direction. It's just a pure mismeasurement argument. And once one puts in the intangibles, there's actually no evidence at all, even in the US, of any increase in market power. So that's statement number one. We're going in the wrong direction there. Statement number two is, so what is it then that's going on? Here, Diane's explained it very well. I'm rather attracted to the Besson argument, and I think it has some traction in the era of AI, because what is it that these AI firms are doing is they're training new business processes on the data which they have got. So if you speak to Rolls-Royce, for example, the big group at Imperial, they have enormous amounts of data on the performance of their aero engines. They're training their new developments, on all of that, but nobody else is seeing those data. So I think there is some evidence for the notion that these intangible assets are getting more appropriable. Last thing, if I may, Tera, sorry for this long question, apologies. Last thing is, you made the assumption, well, what's going on with the slowdown? And there, I think, where we go wrong is by lumping together the entire global financial crisis era. If we split it out between 2011 and 2016, we see that the economy actually recovered from a productivity point of view. Total factor productivity was rising, investment was rising. But in 2016, investment completely collapsed. Guess why that was? We had a certain referendum on something. So it's not one smoking gun, but I think that's the way to think about these things. Again, apologies for a long question, but I enjoyed the presentations very much.
Thank you. Jakob, you want to start with your thoughts on intangibles and whether it is just a measurement issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think we actually disagree all that much. I mean, so for starters, in our report, we show that markups are strongly correlated with investment in the sort of intangibles we can measure in the business data. I completely agree that, in my view, the US markup figures are inflated. And, we've seen in paper after paper that they come down when you start to account for production technology in sort of a more serious way. I at no point do we make the claim that this is linked to the productivity slowdown. I think if you read our report, we very much take this view that there are sort of technological changes that essentially are being conflated with market power here. Hence my mentioning returns to scale. The one point where I would push back is that actually, if you just talk about the overall trends, people have now started scaling up the sort of BLP type demand measurement or estimation of markups and market power, and you do find similar trends, right? So, maybe there's something else that's being mismeasured here. That's possible, but these two complementary approaches, converge on similar aggregate trends.
Diane?
My modest pushback, Jonathan, would be that in the tech sector, I think there has been market power, and you can see the manifestation of that in the degradation of the services that the big tech companies are offering. That may be changing because of the generative AI revolution. So we've seen entry from OpenAI, maybe DeepSeek. So there's something going on there. That explains why the incumbent big tech companies are trying so hard to make sure that when we use AI, it's bundled with their existing products. So that's for grabs. But I think in digital markets, there has been market power.
Yeah, I just want to check my understanding because this argument is new to me, but I think it's really interesting. So Jonathan, if you take my argument, the sort of two sharks argument, maybe I have to do a paper called Two Sharks now, that you've got diffusion, which wasn't on the list of the conference, no criticism of the organisers. So it is important that we have people inventing these things and then they spill over to some public good characteristics. Part of what you're saying is that investment, your Rolls-Royce story, things are becoming more pure private good type characteristics. So if those two stories are what generates productivity, then the shark on the left with everyone trailing along with it, you're going to see less of that over time. The more, that's interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting, thank you. I am looking around for any more hands. Yes, let's take those two questions, or actually the three questions.
Thanks, David Milliken from Reuters. A couple of sort of quick things. One, I know that something that most of you didn't mention, which Jonathan did, was sort of the impact of sort of the Brexit referendum and whether that's something that you see really as sort of a second-order issue and that sort of other factors are likely to be more important. And second, if there are sort of quick recommendations that you'd have for the government when it comes up to its industrial strategy review, which I know Diane sort of touched on, but if others have sort of thoughts on where the government should be headed on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll pass on that question. Thanks very much.
We'll get Richard and Jakob to. Maybe I will apply.
You give me some recommendations. I'm not doing the industrial strategy, by the way.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Sanjay Mahajan from the Office for National Statistics. 2 or 3 quick points. Firstly, many years ago I did concentration ratios using obviously data within the ONS. And what we did was the top 2 companies in every industry, the top 5 companies in every industry, and the top 15. And in some industries, it was really strange how things were progressing over time. And in some industries, the top 2 was very different from the top 15. And so some industries were already very much concentrated and others less so. So that article was around about 2005-06, still valid in a way. And I'm hoping we might redo that, so I'll take that as an action. But secondly, I think we need to look at these through global value chains, especially for the multinationals. They've got national supply chains and they've got global supply chains. And when COVID took place, how the multinationals changed their business models so quickly was very interesting, because parts of their models actually broke down. They didn't have the products. That's a key point. And then the Brexit thing, there was a lot of businesses moving their production away from the UK into the EU and or beyond. In a sense, I thought that would have been a blip. It looks like there may be a trend change as opposed to a blip. But in a sense, what's also happened on a considerable scale is on globalization, innovation and thoughts and new items have come about in this country. Patents are not in the UK, the patents are in China. The growth of patents from the EU and the UK in China is phenomenal in the last decade. And then obviously the production is abroad. Now this leads to a measurement challenge that we have. If there's no change of economic ownership and the production's taking place in Malaysia or South Africa or in Brazil, it's output of the UK. I deliberately paused there. It's also exports of the UK, depending on the model that they're using. And what we're finding as we get into these big multinationals, more and more export we're finding and more output we're finding, which then changes a lot of our notions of productivity. We're getting more of it back. And that is a measurement challenge. The concept's right, it's a measurement challenge. So what we're saying in a sense, some exports of the physical goods that leave the UK are not part of the UK activity. But there's chunks of exports that never cross the border of the UK we need to capture, and the HMRC wouldn't capture that. So that's a big measurement challenge. And what I would ask Jakob, for example, and others, is in the analysis that you do, if you can split goods, manufacturers from services, etc., you may well find some very different patterns of behaviour there. And then likewise the tangibles and intangibles. Thank you.
Thank you. And shall we take the last third question?
Yes.
And then lots for the panel too.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. Again, my question is about measurement around the same issue, which is the theme of the conference. First question is, the measurements for business dynamism do not take, the existing measures do not take the initial conditions or the startup conditions that the firms enter the market with. Do you think there is scope for incorporating this, like recent work with US data by Guzman and Sturck and others? The second question is about markups. I agree with the concerns raised about the relevance or reliability of the markup measures we use generally, the Locker et al. Basically. But what about accounting-based markup measures? Simpler, less depending on models. What's the scope for relying on this? Particularly the markup measures proposed by Barkai based on excess profits. Thank you.
Thank you. Some fantastic questions here, both in terms of measurement and how we can progress that agenda, but then also policy implications. So I don't know if anyone wants to start with the questions around how we should be measuring markups, and then Diane, I'm sure you can say quite a lot of stuff about how we're measuring exports or not. And then very interested in all of your thoughts on both Brexit and industrial strategy, where you can comment.
Yeah, so I mean, on industrial strategy, anything we're prepared to say is in the report. So I'll refer you to that one. And apart from that, I won't comment on policy. But on the various measurement issues, so I hope I'll remember everything. So starting from concentration measures, we report those in our State of Competition report, so both HHIs and various concentration ratios. I think they're pretty meaningless, both because industries are in markets, but also because they miss the local aspect of competition. So I have a paper in a parallel session that my co-author Samir Doshi is presenting, where we use Visa card spending data to construct local retail markets for the UK. And say for food and groceries, there's about 3,000 of them. So just thinking about these national concentration measures makes very little sense to me. On accounting profits, I'll punt on the patents because I think there are other people better placed to answer this, although we split everything by services and manufacturing and much more finely if you want to see it in the report. On accounting profits, Yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off. We report profit rates as well. I generally think that there's probably not that much gained, given that a lot of these numbers are sort of made to optimize tax payments and sort of other considerations that, as economists, we don't think are relevant to the problem at hand, but, we're reporting those too. I mean, in general, I would say that it's a bit different in the academic work I do, where sort of I can take more of a stance, but in anything we do as the CMA, we try to be very Catholic, show, all the measures, and then, allow people to make up their minds based on the breadth of evidence.
Thank you. Diane?
So on Sanjeev's point about understanding what's going on in these multinational chains across borders, when the production models have changed and you get different patterns across different production models, I think it is a big gap. There's a chapter in this marvellous book talking about it, but not proposing any solutions to that, except let's get some more data on it. I don't know enough about the accountancy-based markup measures to comment on that. Brexit, of course, I suppose if you're a microeconomist, you think of it as just part of the environment, like there was a COVID pandemic, there was an energy shock, there was Brexit. But of course, it's clearly had an impact on UK output.
Yeah, I mean, just starting with that, to your question, David, is hugely important. So the data on UK, macro data on UK investment, lots of different ways you could improve it, but the things people normally show is just gross fixed capital formation. You can go into that and find the business investment series, which is part of it, and you'll see a really clear kink, to Jonathan's point, in that, right? I think maybe, don't quote me, it may be below, again, in nominal terms, where it was in 2016. That's not how a growing economy should or would operate. On markups, look, I haven't looked into this whole debate, but I just wonder, would not coming at it from a completely different angle, which would be a financial research approach, make you, to your point, Jonathan, even more skeptical? Because if you're telling me a story that in each industry there's some big shark that's gobbling up all the other sharks, and this is bigger, and then it's got this market power, so its markups are going up, and then you told me, okay, what are you going to expect from the financial markets? I would say, well, some real outperformance. Stock. The expected dividends, forecast dividends should be really high, so stocks should be outperforming. They're not outperforming; they're underperforming. Separate off the big seven, or whatever you call them. The UK too. So this is supposed to be a macro story, right? It should apply across the big firms across the economy. That includes the FTSE 250. That is underperforming. People don't want to invest because the profitability is low. How is that consistent with high markups? A question. On recommendations, if I may. So you say doing the industrial strategy.
The government's doing the strategy.
Oh, yeah, of course.
We're telling them whether they got it right or not.
Potentially, yeah. So two things. The first one would be, both of them financial. The first one would be the role that limited liability plays in the UK. This one comes from, David, you will like this, maybe others in the audience won't. It comes from journalistic work, which is that any time I've ever done sit-downs with firms in the UK, small to frankly pretty big, they say, when you go to a bank and ask, can we do this? They say, well, we could, but we could also just extend the mortgage on your house, right? May seem quite a sensible thing. First brush, it's some collateral. Think what that does to your risk-taking, your psyche, your risk-taking. That's the exact reason we have limited liability, that we don't want that to be going on. My prior, based on a small sample, different type of research, but in-depth discussions with people, is that is widespread in the UK. First thing. Second thing, get rid of the, and this is really difficult because it's historic, this lionization of SMEs. I know you know all about this, but it's not about small firms, it's about young firms. There's really clear evidence from the US that you should focus on the young firms, that things like the small business, there's a really great paper on small business loans and how mistargeted they are. You're basically firing a financial gun over loads and loads of small firms. Some of them are young, you should be targeting them. Some of them are old. When a firm is still old after about 10 years, it doesn't grow. And maybe it shouldn't want to grow. It's happy being a corner shop or whatever it is. So young firms, not small firms, and limited liability, I think, are two key things.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? I'll come back to you, but I wanted to take the kind of flip side of the discussion we've been having on superstar firms, mega firms, big firms, all of those people potentially on driving the frontier and then having both positive and negative effects. We also find, I think from ONS data, also McKinsey has done some recent research that there's a huge chunk of firms at the bottom who generate negative or zero productivity growth. I think roughly 50% in various different samples. And so is there an issue about exit as well as entry here in the UK? And if so, are there any kind of policy responses that we could have to helping that reallocation that we ultimately want at the firm level? Okay, Richard's nodding.
Well, I mean,
start with him.
Just very briefly, if my limited liability argument stacks up, someone needs to do this paper, then yeah, that would be a problem, right? Because basically you've got people across the country who started a firm and they actually borrowed some money for that firm by extending the mortgage on their house, and that's going to give them an incentive to try and keep it. It's a form of zombification. If you don't like that argument, then Philip Aguillon's, those two recent papers I gave, that's essentially the story there. You've got firms that are kind of keeping going, even though they said they were going to invent something, they didn't invent something. His stuff's all for French data, but it does have data, and so yeah, that's a story about firms that kind of should go out of business, or be gobbled up by other firms but aren't.
So arithmetically, that's clearly correct. I think politically and in human terms, that's not necessarily the way to go, because a lot of people work in small firms and have them. The bit to concentrate on for the UK would be below the top 10 or 15%, down to the halfway mark, and the young firms. So can we turn young firms into big ones, and what can we do to improve the productivity of the middle part of that distribution? Yes,
I agree with that in terms of policy response. I think in the narrative, though, we're getting very muddled up because people are talking about SMEs as engines of the economy. They're engines of social value. I can totally buy that, but not a lot of them are necessarily engines of the economy. Questions, comments? Yes, please.
Thank you. Chris Johnson from the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. I've seen a couple of papers that argue that actually business dynamism falls when there's an aging or lowering population. I'm just wondering what the panel's thoughts on that are, and is there actually a risk that while we all agree business dynamism is important, it's actually just going to be still low due to the UK's aging population? Thank you.
Really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so I tried to allude to this in the presentation. I think explanations of the fall in business dynamism are currently a bit overdetermined. So, the demographic reasons, I think, are one possible culprit, but we don't know. And I think sort of separately, and again, that's something I tried a connection I tried to make at the end of my presentation is that regardless of what the structural factors are that might be driving this, there are still policy levers that relative to the status quo might allow us to raise. And those two are possibly distinct.
Any other questions? I also have yet another question for the panel if nobody in the audience. It goes back to industrial strategy. I know you weren't keen to comment on policy implications, and that's absolutely fine. But I was really intrigued by the chart you showed around where they sit in the kind of value chains, both upstream, downstream, and then how integrated they are, how fundamental they are, but also Diane's chart, which shows that these are many of the sectors where productivity growth really slowed down. And I'm intrigued by whether as a country, when we're thinking about industrial strategy, it makes sense for us to pick sectors, and whether it's a coincidence that they happen to be, you know, sort of middle upstream and also very fundamental to the rest of the economy. So any thoughts on kind of how we should think about sectors in industrial strategy, or whether it should actually go down to the firm level? I'm just throwing that out there.
I've looked at successive industrial policies, which you can't call strategies because they keep getting overturned. And the same sectors do come up time and time again. So there's definitely something real about these being strengths of the UK economy. I mean, sectors, as I've been saying, isn't necessarily the right way to think about it. You might want to think about it in terms of particular capabilities, technologies, particular anchor companies and supply chains, and building out around those. And so that would take you to thinking about, you know, genomic discovery, for instance, and building out life science supply chains, and possibly building a technical services sector that specializes in life sciences that then can export to other countries. So that is the way I think about it. But the headline sectors make a lot of sense.
Just add, I guess. So my reading of course we'll have to wait for the white paper, but my reading of the green paper is that there's quite a lot of horizontal thinking in government going on around industrial strategy. The reason in our report we focused on sort of the vertical elements is because it's essentially one of measurement. So now, thanks to the OECD and academics such as Rika Juhas and Nathan Lane, we start to have quite good data on vertical industrial policies, and so that gave us the lever to hopefully support our colleagues in government in there.
So just let me check. I understand the policy jargon. So vertical means when you're picking industries or firms, and horizontal means things for everyone.
Yes. Right. Skills or
Yeah. So thinking has kind of ebbed and flowed on this, hasn't it? Let's be honest. 10 years ago, the kind of received wisdom, and I was pretty responsible for that, and they still pump it out from places like The Economist magazine, would be, if you pick winners, either sectors or firms, you're just going to be wasting public money, right? And that harked back to sort of British industrial policy of the 1970s. I think what we can say is that, I'll come back to that, but what we can say is anything horizontal, anything that, in other words, helps all firms, you should definitely do that. That's like the stuff you should definitely do. Right, so if you think of things in the UK, have we got it right? Energy, no. Finance, my charts, I don't think so. Staff training, I think there's a big work to do on the tax treatment of training. That's a type of investment. It's treated as a cost. Fundamentally, it changes your incentives of the firm. So the things we should definitely do, which are the horizontal things, there's work to do. There's then a more analytical question. Should we go industry by industry? We didn't used to want to do that. Now we do want to do it. Other countries, China, for example, very clearly pick an industry that we're going to become dominant in steel and just become dominant in it. And I think that some of that is influencing policy in G7 economies. I'm fine with it because they're relatively widely chosen. But I wouldn't go to the individual firms because you're then just going to end up with, cronyism, who knew who granted this loan, that kind of thing. But to reiterate, it is a step. We should just admit it's a step, and it's something that maybe 15 years ago we would have criticised, to go industry by industry. And I don't think that should be allowed to confuse or in any way kind of devalue or lessen the focus on getting the big chunky things like cheaper energy, easier finance. We have no mid-market bond market in this country. Getting those horizontal things right.
I'm sure that's right, and makes it even more important that there continues to be a kind of evolution of these industrial strategies. I find that thinking of it as a kind of, here's a snapshot and one white paper that we write and that's all we're ever going to do about it doesn't seem like the right kind of an approach. And I guess the point you make about, if other countries are subsidizing their industries, then we have a choice. Either we are part of the game and we accept that that's part of being in the game and we are willing to pay that price, and you'd have to do a cost-benefit analysis on it, or we're not, and then we accept that we're just never going to have that competitive industry here in the UK. That could be fine for certain sectors, right, as well. So then we get into a kind of broader consideration of what do we need for national security, what we need for future kind of industrial capability and so on. And we haven't even talked about places, which I don't think we'll have time to do today, but there was one more question here, so let's take that one.
Okay, it's Sanjeev again. Two very quick points. One, we didn't really touch on, it was at the edges, is skills for innovation that generates production for tomorrow. And that needs to start from school and colleges, etc. What do we need training our youngsters, younger scholars for tomorrow, linked to the innovation? And the second aspect is the regions. Because quite a lot of these businesses are polarized, and if we don't think about the regions as well, then we get a polarized country on a very big scale, and there lies anarchy. Whoa.
So is that a question or is it just a comment? Would you like the panel to... How do we address the polarization in regional development and how that interacts with industrial strategy sectors and superstar firms, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, that's how long have you got, isn't it? I'm not sure we can tackle that in the last few minutes. It's pretty clear that the UK is at the extreme of economic inequality compared to other OECD countries, so that doesn't seem like a good place to be. The range of things that you need to do to tackle that is large, and it does include everything from the investment in housing and infrastructure to the R&D spending in universities around the country, and so on. So I don't think I can give you a quick answer to that, Sanjeev, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, this is an economic measurement conference. I think a small, tangible step we can do is just to make sure that the evidence base is there. And so we've tried where we could in our reports, but in state of competition, for instance, we note that the data, unfortunately, isn't there to really disentangle where firms are competing rather than just where their headquarters is or where an establishment is. So maybe a call to the many ONS colleagues in the audience. Better data is always good.
Yeah, I'm prepared to go a bit further than that. These guys that have official roles. I don't think we need any more data on the fact that the country is massively geographically unequal, or the fact that some of the industries, per the game that Tera pointed to, are based in now almost ex-industrial, but that's important. They're not ex-industrial, they're currently industrial, and they're becoming ex-industrial. That's going to massively influence the elections next year, the local elections, regional elections, and then the next general election, clearly. So if you're in a world where, to my previous point, okay, we can all say that anything that helps everyone, we should do that. We should have good basic infrastructure, for example. But we're saying we're not going to do that. We're going to go further. We're going to favour particular industries. There are going to be different tax breaks, different subsidies, different regulatory benefits or something. Then you could slightly lean those, make them even more generous in the areas that are worst performing. Firms respond to incentives and they will set up headquarters in places. We know from special economic zones across the world that they will work. You could set up those places in some of the poorest performing regions.
Some very interesting thoughts. And I thank you all for your brilliant presentations, excellent discussion, really interesting questions, lots of calls for new data and evidence, which I'm sure is part of the reason we have these conferences, to outline what those areas are where there's still a lot of white space in terms of additional analysis that could be done. And lots of new questions and complicated questions for government to think about when it sets out its next stage of the industrial strategy. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists today.